Good morning to all and thanks for attending today. And my thanks to the Friends of Kenwood for inviting me to this series, and to Angela Cox, who facilitated that, and to Helen Payne, who of course is managing the Zoom today. I'm a Caribbean novelist from Trinidad and Tobago, whose work has often been inspired by history and by art. I'm interested in what art historians and critics have to say, and I will comment on some of their findings that are relevant to my subject. I'm here today, as Angela says, to speak to you in particular about the double portrait by David Martin of Dido Elizabeth Belle and Elizabeth Murray, while comparing it to some other examples of 17th and 18th century Black portraiture, and describing how this exploration became part of my research and was in part an inspiration for my latest novel, Dangerous Freedom, which Angela has mentioned, using the life and times of Dido Elizabeth Belle and Lord Mansfield, published last year by Papillot Press, a small but significant press based in the Caribbean, Trafalgar, Dominica, and London. It is also timely to look again at the portrait, since it was attributed to the Scottish painter David Martin about 3 years ago, 2018, previously attributed to Johann Zoffany and then to a number of other artists. I had almost completed a further draft of my novel by the time it was discovered it was painted by Martin, attributing the painting to Alan Ramsay in my fiction. It was fascinating to find that David Martin had been an artist who worked in the studio of Alan Ramsay. I altered the plot of my novel to take this into my story. It will be interesting now to explore what difference the relatively recent discoveries have made to our understanding of the portrait, whether the painterly comparisons with other David Martin portraits, the basis for the attribution, makes any difference to our understanding as to what we think David Martin was doing in his portrayal of a white and Black woman in this way at that time of Britain running the Atlantic slave trade, the Black woman's mother having been enslaved, she herself consequently also enslaved at one time. What and how were the conclusions arrived at that the painting is by David Martin? It is assumed that the painting was commissioned by Lord Mansfield in the late 1770s, early 1780s, though there's no direct evidence of that, though there are other paintings and the fees paid for other paintings by David Martin commissioned by Lord Mansfield. Important dates were established as to what happened to the actual painting once it was completed. In 1796, 3 years after Mansfield's death and Dido leaving Kenwood to marry, the painting is recorded at Kenwood in an inventory listed as a portrait of Lady Elizabeth and Mrs. de Vigny, Dido's married name. It did not have a frame, found in a storeroom with other odds and ends, and it was not mentioned again till 1904, still at Kenwood, inventoried with the title Portrait of Lady Finchhatton seated in a garden with a book and a negress attendant. In 1910, Dido is not mentioned at all. The title is simply Portrait of Elizabeth Murray. Very interesting this, because I for a long time have thought it simply is that and Dido was sort of added on. I was wondering whether the forensic evidence that came with this investigation might reveal that. In 1922, when it was again recorded before being moved to Scone Palace, the Mansfield home in Scotland, it had the title of Lady Finchhatton and a Negress, which it carried till 2018. Philip Moule, the art expert involved with the investigation, concluded that this passage through time shows that the portrait had been sidelined, and Dido lost her identity within a century. No attempt was made to attribute artist or name to the Black subject. What were the reasons for this? Approval or disapproval? We don't know. Dido has become an add-on, Philip Moule says, a decorative add-on. Philip Moule said again. The portrait hung at Scone Palace now carries the title Lady Elizabeth Murray and Dido Elizabeth Belle by the Scottish artist David Martin. The investigation then concentrated on the style of the painting, comparisons made with another David Martin portrait. This one here on the left, as I view it, of Lady Marjorie Murray, and alongside the double portrait, not the best of reproductions. Similarities are seen in the hand held to the face as with the Dido portrait, though not quite the same. The use of flowers in the hair of Elizabeth Murray. There is similarity in the treatment of the fabrics and the use of light on the dresses worn by the subjects. There are the pearls that the women are wearing. These are some features in this portrait by David Martin and in other examples of his work. This led to a forensic investigation, which discovered a similar pigment used and similar application of paint and similarity in the artist's brushstrokes. These forensic discoveries then turn the evidence decisively into being compelling that the painting is by David Martin. There was no further discussion that added to our view of the painting that has come down to us through quite a number of commentators. The subjects seem to have a friendly relationship and that the eye line of the subjects established them as equals. This is seen as an important difference with many other paintings of Black subjects with white subjects of the period. The portrayal is rare and unusual in this regard. Philip Moule does mention that the props used of a book held by Elizabeth Murray, something particularly pointed out in the title of 1904, and a basket of fruit and flowers held by Dido mark the subjects as different. They concur with other views which I will look at. The Dido is, for example, portrayed as exotic. I had been hoping for more from this investigation about what David Martin's intentions as a whole might have been. There was nothing about, for instance, as I've said, what were the white Scottish artist's intentions while painting a Black woman at a time of the African slave trade and the enslavement of Africans on plantations in the West Indies and America, and at the time when Britain was the lead country in such a trade. In other words, the social, political, and cultural context of the painting. For example, that Lord Mansfield, who commissioned the painting, had judged important cases to do with the trade and the capture of Africans to be sent back to the New World. Did David Martin have connections with the abolition movement, as we are told that possibly Allan Ramsay did? Or did he own slaves? This aspect is not part of the analysis. There is one other discovery which was announced after the first announcement on BBC's Fake or Fortune programme. The portrait we see today is not the original, as Philip Moule, the art expert of the investigation, said later. A fascinating fact was discovered that the Martin painting was extended by another painter, with different priming some years after it was painted. Take the additions away, and the cousins get emotionally closer, says Philip Moule. Dido and Elizabeth, reduced in size, as you can see with the dotted line, become compositionally more central, and there's a greater sense of their duality in the space, the contrasts and the opposites. This, I think, is quite fascinating. I had often thought something was not quite right about this portrait. I'm going now to talk a little bit about how I came to looking at this portrait in the first place. David Darbidine's work, Hogarth's Blacks, on Black portraiture of the 18th century, introduced me to an analysis of Martin's portrait, though at the time of Darbidine writing, we thought it was by Johann Zoffany, and to other portraits with Black and white subjects. It was through the analysis of these other Black double portraits, if we may call them so, that I began to form my view of Martin's. I began with looking at this portrait. Charles Seymour, 6th Duke of Somerset, attributed to both, apparently, John Riley and John Closterman, not sure about that, which features in an earlier novel of mine, Aelred's Sin, 1998, set on the site of a great house in the West Country, connected with the slave trade and slave plantations in Antigua. This stimulated further interest and research into this kind of portraiture of noble men and women with their black indentured servants and or slaves, of which there are many examples. I apologize for the reproduction because you can't actually see the boy very well. And it's very important to see the boy and the dog and how they are aligned together. These are some other portraits. Here we have the boy kneeling in front of a white subject. There is the iconic basket of fruit or flowers. Notice the hands, the fingers, and the movement of those in this sort of drama. The contrast of skin color. Here again, the white figure with the black figure. Again, the basket of fruit and flowers, the dog and the black figure aligned, looking up at the white figure. Bartholomew Dandridge, Centre of British Art it is. And here's a painting hanging in Ham House. Again, garment and flowers to notice. Countess of Dysart and the black servant. The fabrics, so similar in many ways to Dido's. Again, the basket of flowers and fruit. And here again, and in this one, the turban with the feather. Again, the basket of flowers being offered to the white subject looking out, the black figure looking in. I want us to bear in mind these signifiers as we go through the lecture. And here is a Hogarth from the Harlot's Progress. Here is the little boy, slave, indentured labor, with the turban on and the feather. I come back to the Duke of Somerset. This is what D'Aberdeen has to say about this portrait. He is at this point describing how the black figure is aligned with the figure of the dog. Both dog and boy are looking up in admiration. This happens in other portraits with horses and grooms. D'Aberdeen says, a hierarchy of power relationships is being revealed. The superior white, superior in social and human terms, surrounded by inferior creatures, the black and the dog, who share more or less the same status. Let us bear in mind as we proceed the boy's clothes and the object with jewels that he is carrying, common signifiers in these kinds of portraits as the others we have just seen. How were Africans described at the time? D'Aberdeen quotes a number of 17th and 18th century commentators as part of his analysis. They were described at that time as a people of beastly lineage, faculties of smell truly bestial, shameless as monkeys or baboons in their libidinous acts. He quotes Richard Eden and Edward Long, who further talks of the hot temperament of the women, and quotes also from Lord Chesterfield, who argued that African people were the most ignorant and unpolished people in the world, little better than wild beasts. One must ask what formed David Martin's view to paint a black figure. His composition is markedly different from these other portraits, though he might be combining traces of some of these other paintings when we look at the configurations of these figures in these kinds of portraits, their clothes and gestures, to look at the hands and the fingers, the extension of those arms and the pointing of the fingers, the bowls of fruit, flowers, and shells with pearls, and ask what they all signified in the drama of these black and white figures in their historical context. The imperial height, as it were, the imperial gaze. David Martin's portrait is quite different. The eye line is the same, signifying, we are told, equality in painterly terms. Let us look at a fairly similar kind of portrait to the one of the Duke of Somerset. That of Henrietta of Lorraine by Van Dyck, which hangs at Kenwood House. This is what D'Aberdeen has to say about this portrait. What emerges, quote, a sense of loneliness and humiliation of blacks in aristocratic company. The black existed merely to reflect upon the superiority of the white. Tallness is contrasted with smallness, dark skin with white skin, the black as an aesthetic foil. This was a fascination of the age, a desire to own a black boy for the intensity of the color, a boy for sale in Lichfield in 1771, quite close to the suggested date of the painting of the Martin portrait, quote, an excellent fine black. There's also the contrast between the exotic red of his costume and the somber black of Henrietta. There are ideas here, perhaps, of natural in a derogatory sense versus civilized, superiority contrasted with backwardness. There is also a gaze of adoration, as we saw in the Somerset portrait. Significantly, the boy carries a basket of flowers, and he does seem to be a little on the trot, rushing by, wanting to hurry past Henrietta. We might think of Dido as she's sort of almost in flight out of the double portrait, with his adoring glance at his mistress, with an eagerness to offer his flowers to please. Is he being detained or touched affectionately, or what? Owned. Apparently, there is some forensic evidence that the black boy was added on to the original. Why, might we ask? What is the effect? Not to have him and then to have him. Might we call the portrait of the 6th Duke of Somerset and that of Henrietta of Lorraine double portraits, like we do of Dido and Elizabeth? We generally don't, because of a number of painterly conventions concerning portraiture, but also because the black figures are of no significance in themselves, as they are unknown, not named, and the power relationship is obvious. This point raises the disturbing question of these number of children trafficked, as it were, into the country that we find nameless in these portraits, servants, slaves, or indentured, to get round the law, to be able to enter England, Europe at the time. Dido could have suffered a similar fate as one of those children. She was 5 when she first came to live with the Mansfields. Whatever happened to these pets, as they're often portrayed, when they got a bit older? Joseph Wright is an artist hung here at Kenwood with his provocative white girls with a kitten. What do we make of this child by Joseph Wright of Derby? Possibly an abolitionist, painted during the years he was in Liverpool. Sarah Parson points out, by the time that Wright came to paint 2 girls with their black servant, black figures have been common as exotic signifiers in British art for at least a century. She further illustrates this with the example of Père Mignard's Louise de Keroualle, Duchess of Portsmouth, with an unknown female attendant. Might the black girl with 2 white girls be an attempt at equality? We need to know something about the artists to know whether they are alerting us to questions of enslavement, supporting it, or being critical of it. Why is it that the 2 girls with their black servant, enigmatic scenes, here kneeling in front of these girls, the way they look, it is very conflicted, but again with the iconic basket of flowers, fruit, by an artist whom we might expect have been opposed to the slave trade. There are disturbing stories of these black children, sometimes being packed off as adolescents back to the Americas and the West Indies to work on plantations and estates. We know this particularly as Lord Mansfield judged the Somerset case of a young person being recaptured to be sent back. We don't find any documentation alongside that of Henrietta of Lorraine or Charles Seymour, the 6th Duke of Somerset, or the Joseph Wright of Derby little girl concerning the black figure. Patterson Joseph, a writer, actor, and author of a play on Ignatius Sancho, once enslaved and freed, has recently spoken of the outrageous neglect of African figures in art history. He makes a plea for appropriate documentation to accompany these portraits alongside that of the documentation on the white figure. Even if you don't have the name of the black figure, you at least have the history that would have brought the white figure to this painting. We possibly need to be aware of too easily translating the presence of the black figure in one age as an example of what we might like to see now as an example of racial inclusion. Instead, the complete historical context should be noted. There were, of course, examples of what we would call portraits in the usual sense, as we see with this portrait of Ignatius Sancho by Thomas Gainsborough, an artist who has many paintings at Kenwood. And there is this painting attributed to Joshua Reynolds of Dr. Johnson's servant, Francis Barber. Again, more like we would think of a portrait, and it is documented and we know the biography of the subject. Professor John Newman, Professor of History at Glasgow University's College of Art, said, "We do not have the words and sometimes even the names of bound or enslaved people who were brought to 18th century Britain. In many cases, all that remains are the short newspaper advertisements written by masters who were eager to reclaim their valuable human property." It is odd that the claims that are now made by some commentators for the importance and intimacy that Dido enjoyed in the Mansfield household, that her name and the portrait had disappeared for so long and treated in such a cavalier fashion over the years, and also we now know altered to give the effect of the subjects not being as close as the original, and the title altered in a curious way several times. Dido's history does not come down to us with anything like the detail for the rest of the Mansfield family. There are questions that a novelist is interested in. This inevitably feeds into our understanding of what is going on in this conflicted portrait. Does the history of the painting itself affect how we now view the painting? Daberdeen's view of Martin's portrait was important to me because he was examining Black portraiture as a Caribbean writer from Guyana. He says, Black people depicted in aristocratic settings are overwhelmingly male, but many females, as we have seen, expressionless, fawning, maybe beseeching and servile, as we have just seen. Not so Dido in Martin's painting. And when, as I said, when Daberdeen was writing, it was attributed to Zophany. She is the very picture of privilege and equality with white aristocracy. That is what Daberdeen says at this point. As a novelist researching the other fragments of history that pertain to Dido Belle, I was forced to examine further what Daberdeen thought the artist was doing in portraying Dido as privileged and equal in status, if indeed that was the case. That was his intention, compared to the accompanying figure of Elizabeth Murray. Is the artist saying that this is what she was in reality, or what he wants his viewers to think? What did he want his viewers to think, and how did he go about it, and why? We will come again to these questions. And commissioned by Lord Mansfield, you would think he was trying to do a portrait that would somehow reflect Lord Mansfield's wishes. My view was being informed by my research and wanting to bring what I would call an understanding from a Black aesthetic point of view, conscious of the exclusion of Black figures in art and history, or if included, not documented, but rather silenced or othered. Albert Boehm, the American historian and critic of art historian and critic, in his book, The Art of Exclusion, the representation of the Black figure, though he mainly concentrates on the 19th century, I think what he's saying is relevant to the 17th and 18th. Quote, the confusion of formalistic categories with ideological biases is a singular phenomenon in the history of art that has been sorely neglected. The racial opposition of Black and white derives from the color scale. And the quote continues here, the compositional isolation of figures or inanimate motifs that is so central to the semiotics of Western art can be decoded as exclusionary in the political sense. Is the figure of Dido, because of her race, color, othered by being portrayed in this unusual costume and with props which are closely related to those of the other portraiture? An example of this nuanced exclusion. Who she really was is being excluded by being exotic, othered. Or did David Martin have other intentions? My Creole Caribbeanness also helped me to form my position through recollection, familiarity, and sensitivities to bias based on color and race. I was exposed intimately to both racism and anti-racism in my lived experience in my home and in education in Trinidad from the early 1940s, which affected my view as a writer as well as a person of the Black figure. I bring that experience into my viewing and my writing. I also bring a certain responsibility to hopefully redress views established in history, either mistakenly or making deliberate emphasis. I ask again, what do we imagine David Martin brought to his painting of a Black woman at that time? What did he know of Dido? There are 3 written portraits of Dido Belle that have come down to us. Firstly, there's a very well-known one in the diary of Thomas Hutchinson, the governor of Massachusetts, on visiting Lord Mansfield at Kenwood. It's worthwhile reminding ourselves of this description of Dido while we look again at the painted portrait. He gives us a view of her relationship with Lord Mansfield as someone who, quote, was called upon by my lord every minute of for this thing and that, and showed the greatest attention to everything he said. Do we see this quality of relationship in the portrait? He went on to describe her, this is Thomas Hutchinson, neither handsome nor genteel, pert enough. Might we take pert to be attractive, lively, cheeky? What do we make of her demeanor, her beauty? Many commentators interpret the tone of Hutchinson here and also further on in the extract to be possibly derogatory or even racist in tone. His first impressions of Dido include, quote, a Black came in after dinner and sat with the ladies, and after coffee walked with the company in the gardens, one of the young ladies having her arm within the other. She had a very high cap, and her wool was much frizzled in her neck, but not enough to answer the large curls now in fashion. From this eyewitness account, it is established that she is considered to be Black, a Black. She's part of the company for coffee and is in a friendly relationship with one of the young ladies, possibly Elizabeth Murray. Interestingly, as a comparison to the portrait we are looking at, she's wearing a cap, a high cap, and her hair, described as wool and frizzle, suggests, though Hutchinson's tone may be questioned, the hair of an African woman. They're very important because through the ages, the hair of Africans, particularly of the women, was often a point of contention in relationship to white people, and among themselves even, talk of good hair and bad hair. Hutchinson adds a view he has heard expressed and that Mansfield is aware of. He, quote, he knows he has been reproached for showing a fondness for her. I dare say not criminal. Not criminal, possibly referring either to her being a slave in his household, him a slave owner, or a girl kept for his sexual favors. A belle, the role of the mulatto in great houses in the Americas and the Caribbean. Her name and that of her mother, Maria Belle, itself adds to the conflicted nature of the portrait and the entire story of Dido Elizabeth Belle. As Hutchinson's comment adds, Dido being the only name she has. Another example of the vestiges of enslavement, the custom of giving classical names to slaves, an added irony, adding insult to injury, or the way one might name a pet or a ship. What can we think was in the mind of Mansfield in commissioning this painting? And how did David Martin interpret that from what he knew about Mansfield's judgments on matters relating to the slave trade and the capture of slaves in Britain? And what did he know of their relationship Was he aware of how some people may have interpreted the Mansfield-Dido relationship? Criminal, for instance, as suggested by Hutchinson, the governor of Massachusetts? Or was Martin trying to redress that view? Then, from what we know now about the history of the painting, how was his view received, given that the painting was so sidelined and altered to affect the relationship between the women? We learn about Dido as educated in a reference from James Beattie, the Scottish poet, in his volume 11 Elements of Moral Science. Beattie refers to her intelligence. He has been in a debate about what we might now call scientific racism, with someone questioning the intelligence of Black people. He describes what he witnessed. But I happened a few days after to see his, the person holding the opposite views to him, theory overturned, and my conjecture established by a Negro girl about 10 years old, who had been 6 years in England, and not only spoke with the articulation and accent of a native, but repeated some pieces of poetry with a degree of elegance, which would have been admired in any English child of her years. Following this is a note which states, quote, "She was in Lord Mansfield's family, and at his desire and in his presence repeated those pieces of poetry to me. She was called Dido, and I believe is still alive." Let us bear this in mind when we look at the portrait. Who is it that represents educated in the portrait? The book in Elizabeth Murray's hand, the iconic basket of fruit and flowers in Dido's. When my publishers and myself came to discuss the cover of my novel, Dangerous Freedom, we wanted to suggest something different, maybe something even echoing the Hutchinson eyewitness view of her, and seeing the image of the Phyllis Wheatley portrait, herself in London at the time of publishing her poetry, the first African-American published poet, 1773, not far away from the date of the Martin portrait. We did this as a way to redress, if you like, an exoticized view of Dido and have her as educated, perhaps less glamorous, exoticized and sexualized, less othered. She can write and read and recite poetry. Why is she not carrying the book, but instead the iconic basket of fruit and flowers we find the slaves carrying in all the other portraits? What was David Martin doing? In her father John Lindsay's obituary, Dido is described as, quote, "a mulatto who has been brought up in Lord Mansfield's family almost from her infancy, and whose amiable disposition and accomplishments have gained her the highest respect from all of his lordship's relations and servants." How aware was David Martin of these accomplishments? Do we see any of these written witnesses in his portrait? What of being privileged and equal? Putting these views together, we may ask, as David Daberdeen does, why does Martin paint her as privileged and equal, if that is the case? Where did Dido get those clothes? Or should we be asking, where did the artists get those clothes? Or who else may have chosen this costume for Dido? And what were their intentions to portray her in this fashion? These are questions for the novelist. There is a story here. I suppose one can argue that there was a degree of privilege based on the connection with the family through mixed race and illegitimate. We can further corroborate her relative privilege, as we have stated before, with reference to ledgers that show evidence of monies given to her at times and from Mansfield's will. He confirms her freedom in 1783, 10 years before he dies. In 1793, before she leaves Kenwood and gets married to John de Vigny. Where was the portrait hung? Let's remember the portrait is already hidden away 3 years later in 1796 without a frame. Dido goes on to live a life in a more modest home in the district of Pimlico, where she brings up her 3 sons. It's a kind of privilege, maybe. She loses one of her sons, but not the same through death, but not the same as Elizabeth Murray, Lady Finch-Hatton. That's why I ask, where did Dido get those clothes and where did David Martin get those clothes? We must remember that Dido Belle's mother had been a slave legally and presumably Dido for some part of her young life. She's illegitimate and mixed race in 18th century society. It's difficult to see how she is equal and privileged, even as we view her dress in the vestiges of possibly her father's colonial career in India. The turban, for instance, is meant to have been a gift from him. But remember the many turbans worn by Black children. Yet that may be how David Daberdeen sees the painter as painting her, given the eye line. The artist depicts Dido as an exotic young woman, Daberdeen says, dressed in satin and silk and wearing an ostrich feathered turban studded with pearls. Her rich, dusky color is reflected in the nearby platter of lush fruit and is in strong contrast to the milky white skin of her cousin. Lady Elizabeth's outstretched arm reveals the affection in which Dido is held. Both of them face the viewer, indicating social equality. It is a rare portrait in British portraiture. As Daberdeen says and repeats himself, Black people, almost always servants or slaves, are made to look up to their white masters and mistresses, who invariably ignore their gaze, looking out to the viewer instead. So I have no problems with the second part of the quote. This is a rare event in British portraiture. Black people, almost always servants or slaves, are made to look up to their white masters and mistresses, who invariably ignore their gaze, looking out to the viewer instead. But I would like to unpick the first part of the quote. Yes, I would agree, painted with exotic, even sexualized in his description, the lush fruit, the milky white skin of Elizabeth contrasted with the dusky look of Dido. Is this a way of excluding her? If we think of what Boehm has been telling us, the contrast with Elizabeth Murray is marked. Is this an example, as I said, what Albert Boehm calls symbolic contrasts of white and black, oppositions of black and white, translated into ideological statements about race? Despite the new discoveries, the painting still remains a riddle, a conundrum, a puzzle. Certainly the forensic examination and comparison with other David Martin works add to the portrait's artistic history, maybe its value. There's something satisfying in having such a verdict. If we want a portrait of equality and privilege, then we might consider Ama Asante's take on the portrait and on the life of Dido in the beautifully produced and directed film, Belle. The director, on seeing the portrait, exclaimed on the Fake and Fortune BBC programme, "There she is in all her glory." Then we see what Ama Asante has made. I mean, they're pretty well equal here, almost the same. So whose glory is it that she's so amazed at when she sees the portrait? Is Dido really a kind of clothes horse upon which to hang symbolic significances for the artist? A brief aside. This painting was recently discovered, the 17th century, and discovered in Shropshire. Artists unknown as yet, a black and white woman seemingly painted as equals, not the best of reproductions. A fashion portrait, we are told. The direct decorations on their faces to mask blemishes, and that in itself became a fashion statement. It'll be interesting to see what else gets discovered and made of this portrait. Amber Bouchard, the fashion designer historian in her BBC programme A Stitch in Time, is compelling in her search to undress the figure of Dido to see if her dress actually works. Her conclusion is that the dress is a costume. Other commentators have even suggested that Elizabeth Murray's dress was not a dress of the period, and it too might have been a costume, which leads one to ask more questions of David Martin's view and or the women themselves, or who else decided that they should be dressed in this way. The painting remains an enigma. As I say, a masquerade, a charade. The setting may suggest some related points to this view. The Folly Bridge in the background, which we all know when we visit Kenwood, itself a charade, as is much of the Capability Brown style of the Humphrey Repton landscaping, which we love to walk in. But to effect what? In the distance is the port of London, a slave port, the city with the Wren Dome of St. Paul's, the wealth of the slave trade owned by state and church, contributing to the expansion of the cities of England. Dido herself, an example as part of that accumulated wealth with her abundant basket. Such a complex number of possible and contradictory interpretations. The symbolic nature of the clothes, the costumes, may remind us of the expansion, a little, maybe I'm taking maybe a bit far, of the fabric industry and other colonial trade, and the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, which had been built on the cotton trade, picked by slaves on plantations in the Americas, which has its small beginnings in the 18th century. I find it interesting that the features so repeated in other Black slave portraiture and symbolically represented here by turbans, baskets of fruit and flowers, richly worn fabrics, pearl chokers, use of the arms, the hands in conflicted arrangements, reaching out or pushing away, while not exactly ignored by some commentators, is not given more presence in our unraveling of the enigma of this rare and unusual portrait. But instead, we seem to be more excited by the painterly and fashion elements of the age in the comparisons with other David Martin portraits, his formalist categories, as Boehm calls them. Nothing really challenging this painting of a Black woman at the time by a white artist. We are now conscious of our need for more documentation and inquiry into the Black figure, the expanded documentation of Black presence in British history and art. We need to go further now for the presence of the Black presence in this painting, a complete Black history, and not just an indication to the one feature, Dido's cheeky pointing to her finger at her Black skin, if that is what she's doing. Again, I consider the view of Albert Boehm when he asks whether in attempting to make a verbal or visual statement about the Black subject, can the white artist ever be free from bias given the history of enslavement? He says, one of the most grotesque inconsistencies in the development of the Americas, and I would add the Western powers who ran the slave trade, was the idea that a utopian enterprise could be founded on the backs of slaves. The most benign, as well as the most vicious representations of a Black person by a white artist would have to have worked through this gross contradiction. A quote from Albert Boehm. What kind of utopia was Martin trying to paint at Kenwood House? As Elizabeth de Vigny says in my novel, is this David Martin's Dido, Queen of Carthage? Do the traces of the tradition, the view of his age and for centuries before in Black portraiture, undress the underlying exclusion and erasure of Mrs. Elizabeth de Vigny, who lived at Kenwood House as the young woman Dido Elizabeth Belle, who later becomes Elizabeth de Vigny, mother of 3 boys, educated, living in Pimlico with her husband till her death at 43, just 11 years after leaving Kenwood, where she had been for 28 years. She deserves to be framed more fully by history and differently with extended documentation. Hence my attempt in my novel, Dangerous Freedom, to work with fictive empathy, as Marina Warner puts it, to free her from this single framing which so dominates the historical view of her, giving her a voice, as Shushila Nasta argues in her comment on my novel, Dangerous Freedom which attempts to remedy the erasure and the silencing, the othering of her presence in history. Thank you very much.